We're getting a little dark for this Monster Monday, though it's still the best way to start your week. And I do mean that dark rather literally, as we dive into the domain of Dauntless for one of its umbral behemoths. Flock to the features of this feathered fiend as we take a look at the Shrowd. As noted, this creature hails from Dauntless, which I haven't built in a while, and seems to be one of the big umbral creatures. At least, I think so. I'm struggling to find the levels of some of the other umbral behemoths, but I think the Shrowd has the highest level that I've seen on any of these critters. The Shrowd itself resembles a towering mutated crow, but is heavily infused with shadows and the darkness. It even calls forth its shadows to fight for it, either sending it streaking through the air like a scrave, or making a full-on duplicate that fights alongside it. Those abilities are crazy, but they're honestly just the tip of the iceberg compared to a few of the other tricks it has up its sleeves. While the Shrowd features a level of 30 in Dauntless, that obviously doesn't translate very well into Pathfinder. I wanted to use a lower level than the Torgadoro and other Keystone Escalation behemoths, which led to me landing on level 15 for our Foul. Its ability to manipulate shadows and darkness, and create other versions of itself, led to me using the Beast trait. But to really represent the umbral aspect of it, I also added the Shadow trait, which I wasn't sure was meant for living creatures until I saw it on the Umbral Dragon and the Obe. To put our Shrowd together, I felt like settling on the Skirmisher roadmap. With that being the case, I use an extreme dexterity, as it soars quite capably, pulls off some rather graceful pirouettes, and launches some nimble attacks. However, it still uses a high strength, as this fearsome flyer packs quite the punch. But for its moderate ability score, we have its wisdom, as I want to demonstrate this creature's cruel cunning, comboing this with its bestial intelligence. That left me to using a low constitution, which is largely inspired by the fact that the Shrowd is a big ol' bird. Creatures that aren't quite the hardiest of beings. I stuck with the avian theming with a high perception score, and the Shrowd further possesses greater dark vision, allowing its glowing gaze to pierce even the deepest darknesses. When it comes to the Shroud's skills, that extreme dexterity leads to a high acrobatics and stealth alike, allowing it to soar silently and swoop upon prey without anybody the wiser. Kind of like an oversized and really mean owl. I went for a low athletics as it is a fairly standard inclusion for a bestial creature, but it doesn't entirely figure into the Shrowd's kit. In regards to the defenses of the Shrowd, with it being a skirmisher and having that extreme dexterity, I ended up on a high armor class. It needs this defense as it doesn't really feature many other escapes. It's not quite that sort of skirmisher, though it may outspeed the slower sort of heroes. I do have to follow that up with a low pool of hit points to balance out the substantial AC, though it does have an immunity to void damage based on the shadow infusing its form. However, that's it for its immunities, which brings us to its saving throws. Keeping it simple, it has a high reflex save inspired by its dexterity, and follows suit with a moderate will save, just like its moderate wisdom bonus. That leaves its fortitude at a low value, since it does, again, have a low constitution to match that, reaching back to its avian form and the innate fragility in it. As for its attacks, the Shrowd features strikes using both its claws and wings, and both of those feature a high attack bonus. The latter is a bit less common, but is deployed to take advantage of its incredible reach. As such, the wing features an insane reach of 20 feet, and also has the sweep trait to resemble its wide arcing attacks. Despite those two traits and the high attack bonus, it does still use a high damage value for this strike. I felt safe using this higher damage, mostly because it doesn't have reactive strike. It's not able to punish people too harshly for trying to close in on it. Its claws do have a reach better befitting a large creature, and also have the agile trait, since the Shrowd tends to do a series of claw swipes. As such, these only use a moderate damage value, making this its lighter attack and a great follow-up to its wing strikes. Though I do think that's kind of in reverse of how it generally operates in-game. I'm going to give a quick mention to its innate spell, Emphasis on the Singular. It uses a high DC for its singular spell, which is an 8th rank Darkness, though it can cast it 3 times. It uses its high ranks to make it harder for others to counteract it. But really, all I needed was for it to be a 4th rank darkness, as this creates a broad area that not even creatures with dark vision can entirely penetrate. They would need greater dark vision, like the Shroud itself. This is entirely based on the field of darkness that the Shroud can exude, cloaking the battlefield in it and limiting the vision of the heroes as the Shroud silently stalks them. Now, one weakness that I didn't note in its defenses is the Shroud's light blindness. This is a fairly standard effect, enough so to be included in the Universal Monster rules, and it was my attempt to reflect the Shroud's weakness to radiant damage. I didn't want to give the Shroud a weakness to vitality damage, and in this particular case I've represented radiant damage as a mix of plasma and fire in the past, and that just didn't feel quite right either. So I ultimately settled on this concept instead. Moving on from there, we're going to get into stuff that actually benefits the Shroud. And I want to start simple and build up to some of the more complex aspects. The first thing that comes to mind for something a bit easier is its crepuscular crash. The Shroud has an ability where it will leap into the air before crashing down on victims, dealing some minor damage and knocking them around. However, I wanted to mix things up a bit by not making it a standard activated ability, and instead transformed it into a reaction to chase down fleeing prey, and potentially knock it prone if it and other nearby creatures don't succeed at a high DC reflex save. I do worry that I may have overused reflex saves in the Shroud's kit, but I was able to mix it up at least a little bit, as we will see down the line. Getting into one of its activated abilities, we have its Cast Corruption. This is a straightforward effect that deals unlimited use area damage in a small burst with a high DC. Again, I ended up using reflex for this. The unique aspect of this ability is that it can inflict persistent void damage, which is based on the corruption status that the Shroud can inflict. This status eats away at the afflicted's health until they can finally recover from it. The next simplest ability after that is Shadow's Flight. Through this, the Shroud summons a shadowy simulacrum of itself that it sends soaring through the air. I mentioned this earlier, and it uses a similar flight pattern to the Scrave in its swoop. I had designed this to function akin to a trample, or somewhat like the Nightmare's Flaming Gallop, though this is a bit more powerful, with limited use area damage that requires a high DC save against it. It sticks with the idea of the trample or Flaming Gallop, which both require reflex save, though I also had to include the caveat that it could only affect a creature once per use of this ability. Continually counting in complexity, I think Doomsphere should be up next, and this is a fascinating one. When the Shroud uses this, it creates an orb of swirling darkness that remains in a spot. Players can attack this orb, and it is in their best interest to do so, because in Dauntless, if it is left to its own devices, it will explode. The resulting explosion leaves any heroes caught in it at 1 hit point. However, that's a difficult effect to translate over into Pathfinder. To start with, what I've done is that the orb remains in place for 3 rounds, during which time the players get a chance to beat on it. Its hit points are based on extreme damage for a creature of the Shroud's level, and while it has a solid hardness, it features a low armor class. But obviously the big thing is when it pops. When this orb does so, it deals limited use area damage with an extreme DC. And this time I managed to use a fortitude save. However, beyond just that, unless you critically succeed at this effect, you will become some level of doomed. And on a critical failure, creatures are left doomed 3. Now, unless you have Die Hard or something that has a similar effect, if the Shroud manages to drop you into dying at all while you're doomed 3, then it is lights out. This felt like the best way to leave you at 1 HP, simply hanging on a wire's edge. That brings us and leaves us with one final ability in the Shroud's arsenal, and perhaps the most difficult one to design, though the chat about it should be relatively quick. Shadow Clone is a totally original name for an effect that takes 3 actions, as it summons a shadowy duplicate of the Shroud as a minion. As such, this shadow requires commands from its penumbral progenitor, and can't use some of its more impressive abilities, such as this ability itself, Shadow's Flight, or Doomsphere. This mainly leaves it to wail on foes, which it is happy to do, and can even set up flanks with its Corvid creator. The Shroud is a chunky design with some really complicated aspects to it, but I think we've about covered it. This callid corvid keeps conceivable conquerors confounded with crepuscular clones and cataclysms that can collapse characters into corpses if they aren't careful. The Shrowd should be run at night, or in caverns where sunlight can't reach it, so that it can try to avoid its light blindness, unless the heroes exploit it through a spell or similar effect. You gotta make them work for it, and I think that's just my general design philosophy. Beyond that, I'm not sure the Shrowd needs too many companions in an encounter. After all, it can almost make a murder of its own through its shadow clone, and when you start having more than one of them in a fight, the battlefield can get crowded pretty quickly. Let me know what you think of this creature and what other sorts of monsters you'd like to see in a comment. If you like what you see here and want more, be sure to leave a like and then subscribe to the channel. You can also check out the blog, which is linked below along with the Twitter and Discord. Thanks for watching and have a monstrous Monday.